The strangest part of the night wasn't the ticket. It wasn't the dark cul-de-sac, the filthy kitchen, or even the man who opened the door smelling like alcohol and something worse. It was the fact that, only minutes after pulling me over, the same police officer would end up standing between me and something I never fully understood. At the time, I was only trying to make some extra money. For about 2 months, I worked weekends as a delivery driver for the Abdur, taking orders whenever I could. I lived in a suburb of Nevada, so most deliveries were short and easy. Pick up the food, drive across town, drop it off, and move on to the next order. The more deliveries I completed, the more money I made. And I drove fast. Usually, I stayed above the speed limit because I wanted to squeeze as many deliveries into the night as possible. I knew eventually it would catch up with me. I just didn't expect it to happen that evening. A large order came through from a local burger joint. I accepted it, picked up the food, loaded the bag into my car, and checked the address. The destination was a house across town, tucked inside a cul-de-sac. I started driving. Then, as I approached the neighborhood, that familiar glow appeared behind me. Blue, red, flashing across my rearview mirror. I pulled over. The officer gave me a ticket that cost more money than I could realistically expect to make that night. I sat there afterwards staring at the paper, feeling the frustration settle in. I'd spent the evening trying to earn extra cash. Now I was already losing money. Still, I had a delivery to finish. Once the officer returned to his vehicle, I pulled back onto the road and continued toward the address. At the time, I was annoyed. I had no idea that getting pulled over had just delayed me by a few minutes. And those few minutes were about to matter. I drove farther into the neighborhood until I reached the cul-de-sac. The moment I turned onto the street, something about the place felt wrong. It was unusually dark. There were no streetlights. The only illumination came from the houses themselves, and there were only 3 of them sitting around the dead end. The street was quiet enough that the darkness seemed to swallow every ordinary neighborhood sound. This wasn't somewhere that looked welcoming. I found the address and pulled over. Because I was already late from the traffic stop, I grabbed the food and hurried toward the front door. There didn't appear to be a doorbell, so I knocked hard. Then I waited. The door opened. Standing there was an average-height bald man with a grayish beard. In the middle of the beard were brownish stains that immediately caught my attention. Then he spoke. "How you doing?" His voice was loud and obnoxious. Up close, everything about him seemed off. His movements were strange, his behavior unpredictable, and his breath was terrible. He appeared either extremely drunk or possibly under the influence of something. He looked at the food, then at me. "Come in." I held the bag toward him. "No, it's okay," I said. "Here you go." I just wanted him to take the order so I could leave. But he didn't reach for it. Instead, he repeated himself. "No, now come in. I got something for you." That made me hesitate. I told him I needed to get going. He explained that he couldn't tip me through the app and would have to give me cash. That was enough to make me pause. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. I still had the food in my hand. And as soon as I crossed the doorway, I heard a car pulling into the cul-de-sac outside. Then the man slammed the front door behind me. The sound echoed through the house. "Follow me to the kitchen," he said. "Put the food on the table." I didn't know why I listened, but I followed him. The kitchen was disgusting, messy, dirty, and filled with a stale smell that seemed to cling to everything. The man walked toward a basement door. Then he opened it. He went downstairs and told me to wait in the kitchen. The door closed. I heard his footsteps descending into the basement. And suddenly, I was alone. I stood there in that filthy kitchen, trying to convince myself there was nothing to worry about. I pulled out my phone and started texting a couple of friends about what was happening. I didn't know what the man wanted. I didn't know why he'd invited me inside. And I definitely didn't understand why he'd gone into the basement and told me to wait. Then I heard a crash. It came from below. A huge, violent crash that sounded like a large shelf had fallen over, sending a pile of smaller objects smashing onto the floor. I froze. Then came a scream. "Help!" The man's voice sounded like he was hurt. For a moment, I didn't think. I just reacted. I ran toward the basement door and pulled it open. Nothing. There wasn't a single light on downstairs. I stared into complete darkness. "You okay?" I called. From somewhere below, I heard him moaning. I asked where the light switch was. He didn't answer. He just kept saying the same thing. "Help!" I turned on the flashlight on my Samsung phone. Then I started down the stairs. Every step creaked beneath me. The sound seemed incredibly loud in the darkness. I kept the phone pointed ahead, trying to see through the blackness. I made it about halfway down. Then the moaning stopped. Completely. I stopped moving. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It felt heavy. I looked down into the darkness. "Are you still okay?" Nothing. No answer. No movement. Not even another groan. Something inside me tightened. I couldn't explain it, but suddenly every instinct I had was telling me that something wasn't right. Then I heard a tiny cracking sound. It came from somewhere ahead of me, near the bottom of the stairs. It sounded almost like a small pebble being crushed against concrete. I stared into the darkness, and before I could move, a loud knocking erupted from upstairs. The front door. I turned around and ran. I practically flew up the stairs, crossed the kitchen, and reached the front door. When I opened it, I couldn't believe who was standing there. It was the police officer who had pulled me over. Only about 5 minutes earlier, he'd been writing me a ticket. Now he was standing on this man's doorstep, and in his hand were 2 folded pieces of paper clipped together. The officer held out the papers. "Are these yours?" I recognized them immediately. They were mine. I took them from him, but I barely had time to think about why he'd come back before I started explaining what was happening. I told him about the delivery, the strange man, the basement, the crash, and the voice calling for help. I told him that the man sounded injured, but something about the whole situation felt suspicious. The officer listened. Then his expression changed. I showed him the basement door. He placed one hand near his holster and called down into the darkness. There was no response. I explained that I couldn't find a light switch. The officer pulled out his flashlight. Then he started down the stairs. Slowly, one step at a time. I stayed at the top. The beam of his flashlight moved downward until he reached the bottom. Then he disappeared from my view. For a few seconds, nothing happened. I stood there listening. Then came a commotion. Voices erupted from the basement. The officer sounded like he was shouting in response to something happening below him. There was movement, a struggle, then suddenly, a gunshot. The sound exploded through the house. I flinched. For a moment, everything went silent. Then I heard cries of pain. These weren't the strange moans I'd heard before. These were genuine cries. The officer shouted up toward me, "Come help me." I didn't move immediately. He called again, "Get the guy upstairs." I grabbed the flashlight and moved toward the stairs. The officer was bringing the man upward, the same man who had invited me inside. Now he was coughing and screaming in pain as he climbed. The officer was right behind him, controlling the situation. I held the flashlight where he directed me. The man continued yelling at the officer, his voice filled with pain and anger. We finally reached the top. The officer took him outside. Then he used his radio to call for an ambulance. I stood there trying to process what had just happened. Only minutes earlier, I had been alone in that basement stairwell. Then the officer had arrived. He wanted me to stay and give a witness statement. So I stayed. For roughly half an hour, I remained there while everything was dealt with. Eventually, I was allowed to leave. I got back into my car and drove home. But the entire way there, one thought kept returning. The officer had given me a ticket. I had been angry about losing that money. I had even thought about how badly that traffic stop had ruined my night. I didn't realize then that the delay had probably changed everything. If the officer hadn't pulled me over, I would have reached that house several minutes earlier. I would have delivered the food at the same time. I would have walked through the front door, and I would have been alone with that man. Instead, the traffic stop delayed me. Then, only minutes after I entered the house, the same officer appeared at the door. I never found out exactly what the man intended to do. I only knew what I experienced. A strange man had insisted that I come inside. He had refused to simply take his food at the door. He had lured me farther into the house by claiming he needed to give me cash. Then he'd sent me toward the kitchen while he went into a completely dark basement. I heard a crash. I heard him calling for help. I went downstairs. Then his voice suddenly stopped. Something cracked in the darkness. And before I could find out what was there, someone knocked at the front door. The officer went downstairs. A struggle followed, then a gunshot, and afterward, the man came upstairs screaming in pain. That's where the story ends. There is no supernatural explanation. No ghost appeared. No monster came out of the basement. What makes the story disturbing is that the danger seemed completely real and almost impossible to recognize until it was too late. Looking back, every warning sign had been there. The isolated cul-de-sac, the lack of streetlights, the filthy house, the man's strange behavior, the insistence that I come inside. and the dark basement where he told me to wait. But at the time, I was thinking about money. I was thinking about finishing another delivery. I was annoyed about the ticket. I was trying to get through the night. I never imagined that the ticket I considered a financial disaster might have been the reason I walked out of that house alive. The same officer who had cost me money had arrived only minutes later when I needed him most. Sometimes, the most frightening stories aren't the ones with unexplained creatures or supernatural forces. Sometimes, they're the ones where everything can be explained. A stranger opens his door. A delivery driver steps inside. A basement waits below. And somewhere between those ordinary moments, a situation turns dangerous before you even realize you're in it. I drove home that night with the realization that the worst part wasn't knowing what had happened. It was knowing what almost happened if I'd arrived a few minutes earlier. Who would have thought that the same cop who wrote me a ticket would potentially save my life